everybody? Ty here. Hope everyone is doing well. And if you look on the screen, that's why we've kind of changed our plans. Originally, we were going to be doing a spring outlook and kind of discussing what the tornado threat could be like throughout most of April and heading into May. But obviously, we're going to try to cover the more prominent severe weather threat in the short term versus the long term here. Try to help keep people safe. So, in this case here, we're going to freeze on day 6 here and look at our slight risk here. You can see that the Midwest is included in this one. We have parts of Illinois. We have the entire state of Missouri, just about a good chunk of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and even a small portion of Nebraska and Iowa in this as well. Hard to tell at this point what the main hazards would be. Obviously, we're 6 to 7 days out on both of these events, so a lot of this could very easily change here. Now, as we go towards day 7, we have a very large slight risk area that pops up here that stretches all the way from the Great Lakes down towards the Gulf Coast at this point. So almost, I would say, from Cleveland to New Orleans and areas in between could have a risk for severe weather as we get into the 30th here. Note that right now there is not a risk for the 31st. There could be a subsequent threat to follow up on the 30th with this day. Confidence as of right now, of course, isn't that high, hence the predictability to low tag, but we will, of course, go over that as well. We're going to be pretty much going over the weather pattern as a whole for the entire lower 48 here because there are going to be a lot of interesting twists and turns with this upcoming setup here. We're also going to have, of course, the Euro on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here. So, of course, we'll move these together. This is the GFS we're looking at in the main part of the screen, of course. And what you'll notice right now is we have a pretty big ridge that pops up over the western half of the U.S. here. And for most of the week, this is going to help keep us stable. Eventually, though, we do end up seeing a pretty big storm system begin to come in, and this is where our severe weather threat will be starting. Right around this time frame, it's not a huge trough, it's not a very deep trough, but it's an elongated trough that we've seen pretty recently here as we've gone through the month of March here. And this is likely how we're going to be closing it out, unfortunately. There's a chance right now for all hazards to be possible, and you end up seeing that right around the time of sunset towards this region here. So we'll have to be watchful of all hazards at this point. There are a lot of more questions than there are answers at this point. I'd say that convective mode personally might be one of the biggest. I do think that there is an equal chance of either linear or discrete storms, both of which have the potential to produce all hazards at this point. So we get into the 30th. 30th looks like a pretty big day as well. This trough begins to deepen as well, and it really evolves as we go throughout the day here. So we could have potentially a bimodal event here, where we could have storms firing all the way up towards those Great Lakes regions that we were referring to earlier, and then a southern mode off over here towards the deep south and southeast. We'll watch this storm system move out, and there may be an adjacent, almost subsequent threat for the mid-Atlantic over here as we go through the early part of the 31st here. But by mid-afternoon, I would expect that threat to exit the lower 48 here in the East Coast as a whole. After that point, watch what happens here. We end up seeing a pretty big ridge come in after this big storm system. But we do have to be watchful over here towards the southern plains and central plains here, where things are starting to look a little bit more favorable for severe weather as a whole here too. Then eventually we watch this threat potentially transition into the Ohio Valley here in the Great Lakes region as well, which is a little bit out of season for these guys. We usually don't see these threats until a little bit later into the year, or a more active storm signal as a whole from the jet stream here. But it's kind of hard to deny this one. Then, of course, as we go further along, we see yet another ridge come into play here, and this moves over into the deep south and southern plains again. But anywhere that's on the upslope or downslope of this ridge here could see increased shower and storm activity as we get into the early part of April here. And you can see these troughs that are coming in are still pretty robust at this point. So we could be seeing even some action over here towards the southwest here. Now, how far to the east for this southwestern region this goes is still a question here. I've noticed that a few of you guys that watch these videos are from this region. Can't guarantee any rain from this as of right now, but and obviously with this time frame, it's pretty much hearsay, but this is an interesting signal and an interesting trend that I'm going to be watching over the coming days here. So we're going to start to hone in from this point on the 30th and the 31st threats here for severe weather. So we're shifting to the mid levels of the atmosphere. We're mainly going to be honing in on our short waves here. In case some of you are still new here, when we talk about short waves, we're looking for these little contour lines and little ripples or almost waves popping up in here. You can see them over here towards Arkansas. You can see them towards Texas over here. This is going to be where our area of interest is as well. There may be a small chance that we may see an expansion of that flight risk area to potentially include Texas. Really, it depends on other parameters. But like I said, at this range here, we have a lot more questions than answers in regards to how those are going to look. Once we start to get a little bit closer in the range, especially within that 90-hour time frame or less, we'll be able to really start to hone in on this a bit more. But we'll go ahead and move this forward into the following day here, which would be the 30th. And as we get into the day, the really prominent mid-level trough begins to come in. This is the same thing as that trough that we were seeing in the upper levels of the atmosphere, but you can see a much more clear picture of that shortwave popping up here as we get into the early afternoon. This looks like it could be something that's for the southern part of the Ohio Valley. We end up seeing a lot of action towards this region in the early afternoon. Then later into the evening, we see a little bit more initiation towards the deep south and into the overnight as well. So could be a lengthy day of severe weather as we get towards the deep south and also over towards the Great Lakes and the Ohio valleys, and well, might as well even say Tennessee Valley at this point. Eventually, of course, we see that move out, and then of course we're going back to the ridging that we end up seeing to start out the month of April. Getting into the low level jet, interesting things starts to occur here as we get towards sunset towards this region. Obviously, as a lot of us weather junkies know, right around this time frame is where that low level jet begins to kick in, so you'll start to see an increase here. But I'm also seeing an increase in turning of the winds with height towards this region, especially towards that Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky line. This is another tri-state region here. A lot of you guys are very familiar with it, even quad state at this point. So very watchful of that region as we get into Saturday night, and then as we get into Sunday, you can see another corridor of low-level jet beginning to pop up here, along in correlation with that mid-level trough that we're looking at as well. So I think the greatest tornado threat right now, as it stands, would probably be sitting over towards Tennessee, parts of Kentucky, maybe southern Ohio as well. Like I said, more questions than answers at this point in regards to timing and additional parameters here. But definitely seeing a pretty clear signal that severe weather is at the very least possible, especially as we get into the end of this weekend here. So what we're going to do next, of course, is we're going to get a look at our dew points here. Moisture is one of the most important factors when it comes to severe weather, along with the wind profiles that we were just looking at. Now, as you can see, the moisture begins to already build well ahead of our storm system, and by the time we get towards the evening of the 29th here, we can already see our dew points getting well into that 60 to 65 degree threshold here. Even a few areas starting to pop into the 70s. And this is why I'm also kind of curious about this Texas region over here, especially northeastern Texas. But like I said, more questions than answers. Forcing comes into play, etc. I mean, everything does still seem to be there at this point. There does seem to be a short wave. So, like I said, I would not be surprised if areas off to the east of Dallas in particular, maybe even Dallas proper itself, could be a point of interest. Now, as we go into Sunday here, you can already see the frontal boundaries starting to come into play here. There's a decent little gradient, not the strongest, and I do think that could limit that southern mode early on. But that northern mode already looks like it kind of takes off as we get into the early afternoon hours based off the amount of moisture that we have available. Forcing again might be questionable. I do think that mid-level trough here, we will be able to overcome it. But the moisture remains even as we get into the overnight hours. So like I said, could be a long duration event based off what we're seeing on models here at this point. So we'll go ahead and get a closer look at what we could see in regards to the moisture for Saturday night into Sunday here. We're doing a model comparison now at this point. This is the Euro's solution for our dew points here. And you can see that we still have prominent 60 plus degree dew points here. We already know the look for the GFS. And then we also have a British model here. This is the UK Met, which has become better in the last couple of years. So I'm going to start to implement that every now and again. But even though the moisture return isn't quite as formidable as what we're seeing on Euro and GFS, it's a prominent one still nonetheless here. As we go into the following day, this is the 30th, big moist sector for the Euro at this point. So a lot of ripe, juicy air here to work with towards this region. We also have more model options at this point. We have the Canadian model, which is looking pretty similar to the Euro. GFS is in good agreement here. So I think so far out of the 2 days, and this is really saying something when we have the National Weather Service blend of models popping up here and showing a pretty similar solution, albeit the northern mode is still a bit questionable at this time. But if I run across all these models here, they're looking relatively congruent. So pretty prominent signal in particular for Sunday. So this is going to be a day that we watch very, very closely. At this point, it's looking like a live stream would be needed at this point. So make sure you're staying tuned for that. So now let's go ahead and take a look at our cape here. We're bringing the Euro back to the bottom left corner of the screen here. So what I'm going to be looking at here is we're going to be looking at surface-based cape on the main part of the screen and mixed layer cape. They're two different things, honestly. Mixed layer cape looks at all levels of the atmosphere, especially the 3 to 6 kilometer range. So we're looking at the mid levels and beyond in regards to instability. Whereas with this, obviously, we're looking more to the 0 to 3 kilometer range. It's a little bit closer to what we end up experiencing. Surface-based cape in particular is important in regards to that tornado threat. And what you notice if you pay attention here is that as we get into the early afternoon of the 29th, we have a prominent signal for instability here through our cape readings. About 1,000 joules per kilogram is what you would need for severe weather, and we're more than surpassing it on both metrics here at this point. In fact, with the surface cape in particular, there's areas where we're getting up to about 3,000 joules per kilogram, hence why I'm still thinking Texas could be a point of interest, including maybe even Dallas-Fort Worth area. Then as we get into the following day here, it doesn't matter if you see surface or mixed layer cape, another prominent signal over here towards the deep south in particular. Now, the question I do have, of course, over towards the Ohio Valley is, will we be able to get a sufficient amount of instability towards this region? Notice we're kind of struggling over here to get to about 500 plus even, let alone the 1,000 that you would really need to get good severe weather here. But in either case, though, I think with parameters in play, I do think that we'll see an increase or an uptrend with this in the coming days. Hopefully we don't see it, but it seems pretty likely that we'll end up seeing something similar to that. And then as we get into the evening, we watch that instability go away with daytime heating. So last but not least, this is a look at what the entire weather pattern is going to look like over the next 14 to 16 days here. So we'll have the Euro here on the bottom left corner showing that as well. These will be moving together, of course. Here is the first looks at what the radar could look like as we get towards the 29th. We'll see our storm initiation begin to occur later into the evening. I kind of think as of right now, and this is just early speculation, this is not anything that I can really confirm just based off the model data I've looked at. We're kind of leaning into a little bit of a hail threat, I would say, for Saturday night. Do think there could be a chance of tornadoes. I would say if anything, I would look over here towards this region, right around St. Louis, and over towards that quad state corridor. That's where the kinematics seem to be best, or the wind profile. Now, as we go further along, you can see two different modes begin to develop. You see a messy, almost I would dare say maybe a cold core mode begin to occur over here towards the Ohio Valley and over towards the Great Lakes. Then a linear mode pops up for the southeast as we get later into the evening. And then there may be a subsequent threat that lasts into the early afternoon for this region. craziest thing is right now, and of course, obviously, by this point, we're looking over a week out, and this is easily prone to changing. There may be a chance that we see snow on the backside of this system here. Obviously, the GFS and Euro are showing different outcomes here, so take this with a grain of salt as we go further and further beyond here. But as you go further into April here, that ridge begins to come into play. Notice how the picture begins to quiet down a little bit until we get over towards the northwest and the northeast. These are the areas where we're on the upslope and the downslope of that ridge, and this is where the weather is going to be the most active in the days and weeks ahead here. So it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks here. A lot of wholesale changes are going to be likely on the way for the lower 48 as a whole here. But that being said, make sure you're keeping an eye on your area. I'll be making update videos on this as we go along. We'll have the spring outlook probably tomorrow, and I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I hope you guys have been enjoying the content. Make sure you guys are hitting that like button, hitting that subscribe button. Don't forget to leave a comment, especially if your area is at a point of interest, or if you're expecting some big changes from the upcoming ridges, or if you're on the upslope or downslope of that said ridge. But that being said, hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your Monday, and I will see you guys next time.